The corridors of St. Vincent's Medical Center in Chicago lay unnervingly still that October night, a silence almost unnatural in a place accustomed to the fevered rhythm of emergencies and the shuffle of human frailty. The muffled hum of fluorescent lights accompanied the soft beeping of monitors, the only sounds breaking through the weight of quiet. Outside, the city carried on with its usual noise, the rolling wheels of taxis' sirens somewhere in the distance and the damp scent of autumn. But inside the maternity ward, time felt suspended, as though holding its breath. Claire Donovan reclined on the delivery bed, strands of dark hair plastered to her damp forehead. Her hands clutched the sheets in a fragile but unyielding grip, every contraction slicing through her body with waves of force that blurred her surroundings. She was already a week past her due date. The waiting had been exhausting, and the anticipation of relief had given way to dread she could not name. Somewhere deep within her chest, beneath the pain and the pulse of anxiety, lingered an instinct she did not understand. Something about this birth would not be ordinary. Dr. Thomas Green, the attending obstetrician, stood at the foot of the bed, his posture taut with both expertise and unease. His eyes remained trained on the fetal monitor, steady lines indicating no apparent distress. And yet, within his practiced calm, a dissonance gnawed at him. Years of training had taught him to listen not only to machines, but also to instincts that whispered between the spaces of logic. Something here felt different. Claire could not articulate the fear coiling in her stomach. Her husband Daniel had been beside her earlier, murmuring encouragement, but his face had carried its own strain, pale and restless, as though he too sensed the shift in the air. Now only the nurses and Dr. Green surrounded her, their voices reduced to clipped instructions, their eyes betraying something unspoken. The hours of labor blurred together, collapsing into a rhythm of breath, effort, and exhaustion. The sterile light above painted everything too sharply, erasing warmth. Then, amid one final wave of agony, the air fractured with the sharp cry of a newborn. It should have brought a flood of relief, the moment Claire had been clinging to. Instead, a silence heavier than any she had ever known filled the room. The infant had entered the world, but joy did not follow. The nurse who first received him froze, her expression suspended between awe and unease. Instruments clattered faintly to the floor as another nurse, her hands trembling, fumbled to secure clamps. Dr. Green's jaw tightened, his silence louder than any announcement. Claire forced her eyes open, expecting to see relief mirrored on their faces, but found only restraint. Her heart hammered. The voice inside her demanded to know. She tried to rise, but Dr. Green placed a firm, careful hand on her shoulder. "Rest," he murmured, though his tone held no conviction. She pushed against his restraint, her voice hoarse. "Let me see my child." And then, in a moment that would carve itself into memory, Claire glimpsed her son. The nurse hesitated before lifting the small bundle wrapped in a hospital towel, the child's features emerging beneath the fabric. What should have been soft, downy skin was instead covered by a dense layer of dark hair. It swept across his forehead, encircled his cheeks, brushed against his eyelids, and stretched down his tiny arms and legs. The texture was coarse, not the fine fuzz of lanugo, but something older, more primal. Claire's breath caught in her throat. For a heartbeat, she thought she must be hallucinating, delirious from exhaustion. But no, the child shifted in the nurse's arms, whimpered, and his small fingers curled instinctively as any newborn's would. He was alive, and he was hers. What is wrong with him? The words spilled from her lips in a whisper, barely audible, but the silence in the room caught them as though amplified. Dr. Green exhaled heavily, his gaze flicking to the monitor and back to the infant. He is breathing well. His heart is strong. But his voice trailed off. He was not ready to finish the sentence. The nurse murmured something about congenital hypertrichosis, a term Claire did not know but would come to remember. A condition whispered about in the folds of medical literature, rare beyond imagining. Less than 100 documented cases, they said. A genetic aberration, an accident in the blueprint of life. But there was something about Noah. Yes, the name she had chosen long before that defied even this label. His hair was too thick, too uniform. It did not seem fragile or sickly, but purposeful, as though it belonged. Claire reached out her fingers trembling, but the nurse began to carry him away toward the neonatal observation unit. Panic surged. "Don't take him from me," she cried, her voice ragged. "He is my son." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Green hesitated, torn between protocol and the raw force of a mother's plea. Finally, he nodded once, a reluctant surrender, and gestured for the nurse to return. The bundle was placed into Claire's arms, and the weight of her child pressed against her chest. The fur that had unsettled everyone else felt warm and soft against her skin. His whimper subsided into a small sigh, as though he recognized her heartbeat, the rhythm he had known in the womb. Tears blurred her vision. Whatever he looked like, whatever the world would call him, he was hers. Hours passed in fragmented silence. Nurses drifted in and out, their whispers just beyond the doorway. Documents were signed, calls were made, papers shuffled into folders marked with identifiers she could not see. Claire understood little of it, but she knew enough her son was already a subject of fascination, perhaps even of fear. Daniel returned briefly, his face pale and eyes darting away from the crib where Noah lay. When Claire asked him to look at their son, he did, but his expression carried a weight she could not decipher, something between shock denial and the unbearable burden of disappointment. He left soon after, muttering about needing rest. Alone again, Claire pressed her hand against the crib's rail and studied Noah's small form. Beneath the dim hospital light, his fur shimmered almost gently, as though it carried its own quiet radiance. His tiny chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, each breath a testament to life itself. Her body ached. Her mind reeled, yet in that moment she felt an anchor she had never known before. Fear pressed at the edges of her thoughts, the whispers of what others might think, the possibility of strangers demanding answers, the looming shadow of science seeking to dissect what it did not understand. But beneath it all, a deeper truth resonated. Nothing could sever the bond she felt for him. In the early hours of morning, as the hospital buzz began to stir again, Claire whispered into the stillness, her lips close to Noah's soft crown of hair. "You are not what they see. You are not what they will call you. You are my son. You are Noah." And in the fragile quiet it seemed as though the universe itself leaned closer to listen. Morning arrived like a thin, uncertain light poured through frosted glass. St. Vincent's, awakened by Degree's rubber soles whispering along waxed floors, carts rattling over seams in the linoleum, the low chorus of voices trading duties and restraint. For Claire Donovan, the hospital had become an island where time obeyed the clock of other people's decisions. Forms were printed. Conversations occurred just outside her door with the caution of people who believed walls had ears. She could feel those conversations trailing behind her like a shadow she could not shake. Noah slept in the bassinet, a small weight resting at the edge of her world. His breath rose and fell in precise measure, a rhythm so gentle it pulled the sting from fatigue. In sleep, he seemed less a controversy and more a child, warm, fragile, complete. The fur that had startled everyone lay soft against his cheeks, a dark halo that would appear threatening only to someone who had forgotten the tenderness of first beginnings. A hospital administrator came with a smile too empty to hold comfort. Risk management had drafted recommendations. Public relations had circulated language for a statement that would never mention a name. Pediatrics wanted 10 minutes. Genetics wanted a sample. Neonatal wanted 2 days. By the time the procession of professional voices had passed, Claire realized the plan for her son's life. His first hours was being written in a grammar that did not contain the word mother. Before noon, she called Daniel. The ring stretched on long enough to make her understand the distance between a home and a silence. When he answered, his voice sounded as if it had used up its strength on something else. He said he needed time, a word that had never felt so sharp. He assured her he would be back by afternoon. He did not come. It was a nurse who reached her in the place where fear becomes movement. The woman's eyes held a softness the building could not teach, and a steadiness the protocols could not erase. She adjusted a blanket, checked a monitor, and arranged her silence with the precision of someone who knew the cost of words. When she finally spoke, it was not advice, but a path. "Discharge can be signed," she said quietly, as if the air itself could carry sound to the wrong ears. "If you choose it, it can be done today." Claire looked down at Noah. She understood what selection meant. It meant stepping off an island onto an ocean without maps. It meant making her body the doorway between her child and a world reluctant to welcome him. By late afternoon, papers were pushed across a counter that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner. Signatures bloomed beside names, a series of small, unremarkable gestures that would, in the long telling, separate one story from another. The infant seat clicked into place. The bassinet became a memory. A side entrance led to a parking lot that tasted of October and wet asphalt. Somewhere behind them, a rumor would flicker to life. In front of them, the city's grid opened its mouth and swallowed. Chicago gave way to interstate the way a sentence breaks into clause and then breath. Traffic thinned. Light shifted toward amber. The skyline dissolved in the rear view like a promise that had decided to remain abstract. Claire kept both hands firm on the wheel of an old sedan she had acquired with cash and urgency. Its heater grouchy. Its radio unreliable. Its trunk containing a box of blankets formula, and the kinds of groceries that do not require refrigeration or faith in appliances. At the edge of Cook County, she stopped for gas and watched her own reflection in the window of the convenience store, a woman who had slept in small increments for a week and still found in herself a posture that suggested forward. For 2 days, she moved west, cautious and unimportant, a figure stitched into the wide seam of America. She learned the names of exits as if they were stanzas in a poem Des Moines, Kearney, Cheyenne, without ever stepping far from her car. She paid in cash and chose motels where no one asked questions with their eyes. She kept her phone off except to send a single message to Patrick Miller, the cousin who had never been loud and never been late. On the third morning, Patrick's truck found her in Wyoming as predictably as sunrise. He looked older than she remembered, or perhaps simply more deliberate. He lifted the car seat with both hands. He did not ask about fur. He did not ask about headlines. He did not ask why she had left. His silence was not the hospital's. It was the silence people use when they choose respect over curiosity. They crossed the Cascades under a sky the color of pewter. At the Oregon state line, the air changed its scent moss cedar rain that had memorized the contours of a forest. Patrick left the interstate for a county road that threaded through stands of pine. Houses fell away. Power lines thinned. The last miles were a lesson in gravel and the patience of tall trees. The cabin belonged to someone who had taken a contract overseas and left his life here like a book on a nightstand. A page held with a scrap of paper. 2 rooms, a kitchen that could be cleaned in 10 minutes, a porch wider than either. There was no internet and more quiet than she had known was possible. Patrick carried in the box of groceries and the crib he'd found at a thrift store. He fixed a latch, checked a lock, and left cash in an envelope that said nothing about humility or pride. When he drove away, the engine's sound unraveled along the road and was replaced by wind, a low, continuous idea moving through the trees. Claire stood on the porch with Noah against her chest and felt at last the weight of arrival. She had not come to safety so much as to a truce. The world could not reach this doorstep easily. She would learn to meet it on her terms. Days gathered themselves into a shape she could live inside. Mornings were steam over coffee, the ritual of sterilizing bottles, the small domestic choreography of a life newly paired to an infant's clock. She bathed Noah in a shallow plastic tub on the counter, water shining on his fur like a thin sheet of lacquer. She learned the tones of his cries and the meaning of their nuances. Hunger's insistence, fatigue's complaint, the sudden brief flare of discomfort that broke as quickly as it arrived. When he slept, she opened her laptop long enough to write a reply to a Boston client who still believed in deadlines like constellations. By the end of the second week, the cabin had learned their sounds. By the end of the third, the forest had learned their routines. Claire warmed her hands against a mug and watched the slope of light across the floorboards. She took no photographs. She posted nothing. The internet had somehow acquired a blurred image and had already named him. She would not feed anything that could be starved. In this new place, the world did what it always does when it feels shut out. It invented. Tabloids tried on phrases like a child tries on costumes. Experts performed certainty at a safe distance. Forums confused rumor with witness. Even the well-meaning could be dangerous when fear and fascination braided into a single impulse to know. It was a morning scraped clean by rain when she first carried Noah to the park at the edge of the little town. The path there wound along a narrow creek, then slipped under the canopy of a stand of Douglas fir. She had chosen a weekday an hour when most people were bending their lives around work. A single bench sat beneath a low-branching pine, its needles combing the air with the sound of patience. Noah stirred and blinked. His eyes, too dark to decide between brown and something else, caught a small piece of light and held it. For a few minutes the world agreed to be simple. A white dog hurried past with a man who held the leash as if he had been entrusted with a secret. A pair of black-capped chickadees negotiated a question about a branch. The creek rehearsed its sentence over stones. Claire lifted Noah and pressed her cheek to his, the fur tickling her skin like a whisper. She breathed in his warmth and the clean hum of damp earth and wood. They were leaving when she noticed the man at the edge of the trail. He stood too still for the posture to be casual. His hands hung at his sides. He did not look at the trees, the path, the sky. He looked at them with the steadiness of a person who had reduced the world to a problem he intended to solve. Something in his gaze felt practiced, a focus that would not consider adjustment. Claire tightened her arms around Noah and adjusted the strap of the diaper bag. She kept her pace measured. The stroller's front wheel bumped a root and corrected. The man stepped forward, not a shout, not a run, simply a closing of distance that made the air feel thinner. Smell finds you first. She caught the chemical sweetness of gasoline and the dull warning of singed cloth. The man's right hand held a bottle with a rag tucked in its neck, the glass glinting a small, cruel geometry. In his left, a lighter, the thumb already white with pressure. His mouth moved without the world's help, shaping words she did not hear, and then one word she could not misunderstand. Monster. The park tilted. Claire pivoted the stroller off the path toward the cover of fir trunks. The stroller's wheels found the soft give of old needles. Branches reached for her coat, then let go. The man's breath arrived behind her with the shape of a decision. She did not run for the cabin. It was too far. She ran for the density of trees, for the place where a thrown ark would lose its answer. The sound came like a word you always recognize, the rush of flame finding something that understands it. The bottle broke against bark with a violent punctuation. Fire shot briefly along the trunk and then spat itself into a scatter of sparks. Smoke moved low to the ground before its purpose lifted. Noah cried not panic, but the raw announcement of distress. Claire felt the sound in the bones of her face. She crouched behind a fallen log, the stroller tipped to its side, her body forming its own poor architecture between heat and child. The man crashed through brush momentum, solving for aim. She did not look at his face. She looked at his hands. The lighter shut with a snap. The second bottle never bloomed. Perhaps he realized he was not alone. Perhaps the sound of someone else's steps broke his arithmetic. A dog barked closer than she remembered the trail to be. The man stuttered in his movement and chose retreat the way people choose an exit they will not remember clearly. He ran. The forest kept his secret and then forgot him. Silence took time to return. Smoke feathered upward through the branches and then thinned until it belonged to the sky and not to them. Claire waited with her forehead against the rough ledger of bark. When she finally lifted Noah, her hands shook the way a bridge shakes under weight, flex hold endure. She checked his arms, his cheeks, the soft valley of his neck. Not a mark. Not a blush of heat. She touched the place where the fur lay smooth along his shoulder blade and found something altered. At first it felt like only a trick of fear, the skin beneath the fur denser than it should be tauter, as if it had considered itself in an instant and decided to harden. It yielded less under her thumb. It carried a subtle pattern, no scales, not armor, Nothing so literal but a coherence like threads woven closer a fabric that could not be pierced by a casual snag. On the walk back, the world reassembled itself around smaller sounds: a squirrel's reprimand, the hush of wind, the creak of the stroller's joint. She retraced the path without becoming lost and reached the cabin without noticing distance. Inside, she locked the door, drew the curtains, and sank to the floorboards with Noah against her. His cries diminished to a hiccuping rhythm and then to breath. Only after that did her own breathing learn how to slow. By evening, the incident had already happened to someone else, a version of her who existed in the tenuous country of the internet. A tabloid appeared on the porch, as if gravity had left it there. The headline performed itself in letters that asked to be admired. A photograph, at once too blurry to be evidence and too clear to be kind, lived on the front page with language that treated mythology as diagnosis. Inside, quotations gathered from sources that did not need to be named. Some suggested research. Some suggested removal. Some softer and more dangerous suggested protection inside the same walls that would never permit a window to be opened fully. She fed the stove with paper she did not want to read again and watched the flames accept their work. Outside, the forest flexed and settled. She considered calling Patrick, then decided to build her voice on steadier ground. She bathed Noah the water, calming him into a concentration that always seemed more adult than infant. She warmed milk and measured a life in ounces. She slept in a chair because the bed just then felt like presumption. Over the next week, a change Claire could not name began to show itself at the margins. The fur along Noah's arms thinned in places, a slow, almost ceremonial shedding that left the suggestion of ordinary skin underneath. No one else would have noticed. They would have seen an infant who simply belonged transgressively to two descriptions at once. But a mother's attention operates on a different scale, sensitive to whisper and degree. She charted the change the way sailors once charted stars, not to claim ownership, only to move truer through their lives. She kept him close. She learned his reflexes. He startled less at sudden sounds than other babies she remembered. He watched more intently. When rain moved over the ridge, he grew quiet before the first drop struck the deck. When dusk deepened, his pupils answered, quickly widening in a dark flower. Sometimes, when she carried him to the window, he tilted his head as if listening to something far away and kind. On the 10th morning after the park, an envelope slid under the door without a sound. There were no tire tracks in the damp dirt outside, no footsteps preserved in the moss. The paper was a decent stock, not expensive, not careless. Inside, a single sheet without letterhead. The message was brief in a way that felt both practical and intimate. You do not have to do this alone. We can observe without harm. We can help without owning. We can protect without taking. K.H. Northwest Institute of Human Genetics. Claire held her breath through the reading as if exhale might erase the words. She did not trust the invitation, and yet something in its restraint refused to be thrown into the stove with sensational headlines and half-remembered opinions. She set it aside, not because it had convinced her, but because it recognized the one thing that could, the promise that kept faith with her first vow. By afternoon, the clouds opened in that particular Pacific way, sheets of rain stepping gently from the sky, as if the world were never scolded for thirst. She lit the lamps early. The cabin glowed like a small lantern left by a thoughtful traveler. She settled in the rocker with Noah asleep against her shoulder, his breath warm, his hair damp in curls that would be gone by morning, where the fur thinned. The day unwound from its tightness and found a quieter shape. In the hush, she returned to the fact that had become a map. The world would come with research words and legal words and words handed down from courtrooms dressed in flags. The world would ask for samples. The world would ask for custody. The world would ask for the right to stand between a mother and a child in the name of something that did not cry or sleep or need to be held. She could not yet imagine how she would answer, only that the answer had already begun the day she first put Noah to her chest and felt his sigh quiet against her. Night gathered like a blanket pulled up by patient hands. From the porch, she listened to water shiver off the edge of the roof. Far down the road, a single engine passed and kept its destination to itself. Inside, a letter remained on the table, its folded silence a third presence in the room. She could not decide if hope or fear had written it. She decided only to keep it until she could tell the difference. And because the world still insisted on its old habits, one more package arrived before midnight, a second newspaper left without wrapper or explanation. Its headline now softened by repetition, its edges damp. She placed it on the stove beside its brother. She understood that she was not living in a story other people would allow to end. She held Noah and made a promise that did not require ceremony. She would not run only because someone else demanded it. She would not surrender because someone else had found a word to make surrender sound like science. She would go into the woods when the path required it, and she would come out when love demanded it. Between those two directions, she chose the work of every hour. If this story of courage and tenderness resonates, consider subscribing to our channel to follow more healing journeys and support the work behind them. The cabin had settled into its own rhythm, the kind of quiet pulse that life makes when measured only by an infant's cries and the turn of seasons outside the window. Weeks stretched into a pattern Claire Donovan could almost trust bottles sterilized in the faint light of dawn. Noah asleep in a nest of blankets during the long hours of afternoon nights punctured by his small whimpers and her steady response. Patrick Miller's occasional visits brought groceries, fuel, and the silence of loyalty. But beyond that, the cabin was theirs alone, insulated from the chaos that had once consumed them. Noah's fur had begun to thin first in patches, then in delicate waves that left behind pale skin beneath. By the end of the second month, Claire could wrap him in a soft cotton onesie, and to a stranger's eye he was no different from any other infant. She knew otherwise. She had seen the way his flesh had resisted fire, how the strange density beneath his skin had shifted like some silent guardian. It was not an illusion. It was part of him. Yet, for all the changes, she clung to the simplest truths. He drank, he laughed, he slept with his tiny fist curled against his cheek. He was her child. Still, the world was not content to let them disappear. Newspapers had tried to keep the story alive, tabloids with their invented certainty forums with their blurred photographs. And, though Claire ignored them, she knew the silence around her was only temporary. Institutions had long memories and deeper patience. What they could not seize by spectacle, they would attempt to claim by law. It was into this fragile balance that Daniel Donovan returned. He arrived on a cold morning in late December. Claire heard the crunch of tires on frozen gravel before she saw him. For a moment she thought it must be Patrick again. But the sound was different. Hesitant, searching, as though the driver did not quite believe he belonged here. She lifted Noah into her arms and stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass. The truck that pulled into the clearing was not Patrick's. It was smaller, older, its paint dulled by years of use. When Daniel stepped out, Claire felt the air contract. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face shadowed by sleeplessness, his eyes carrying the wreckage of choices he had not confessed. His coat was pulled tight against the cold, but it did not hide the weariness of a man who had been walking through storms of his own making. For a long moment, they only regarded one another through the glass, two lives once bound now frayed into separate threads. Then, with a slow breath, Claire unlatched the door. Daniel stepped inside, carrying the chill of winter with him. He looked at Noah, really looked, and for the first time in months, Claire saw softness flicker across his expression. Noah stirred in her arms, his eyes dark and steady, and then, astonishingly, he smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it was enough to draw Daniel forward as though gravity had chosen sides. "Hello, son," he murmured, his voice breaking on the simple word. Claire said nothing. She lowered Noah into his crib and crossed her arms. Waiting. Daniel tried to fill the silence with apologies, with stories of regret, with confessions about nights haunted by headlines and mornings filled with the absence of his family. He said he had been wrong to leave, that fear had twisted him into someone unworthy. He wanted to make amends. He wanted another chance. For an hour, Claire listened, though her heart remained guarded. Part of her longed to believe him, to accept the comfort of two parents instead of the ache of solitude. Another part remembered the hospital, his averted gaze, the weight of abandonment pressed into her bones. Trust could not be summoned by words alone. Even so, she allowed him to stay the night. They shared a dinner of bread and soup, simple and warm. Daniel rocked Noah gently while Claire cleaned the dishes. For a moment, the cabin carried the illusion of a family reclaimed, fragile but glowing. It was the next morning that illusion shattered. Claire woke early, the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb Noah's sleep. In the living room, Daniel lay on the couch, a duffel bag at his side. The zipper had fallen open slightly, exposing a corner of paper. She bent to adjust the blanket over him, and the papers slipped free. She froze. The documents were unmistakable contracts, correspondence agreements with research facilities in California. Legal jargon spilled across the pages, cold and deliberate. One page bore the letterhead of a private biotech corporation. Another carried the seal of Northwest Gentech Laboratories. And then beneath them a check stub, $50,000 issued in Daniel's name. The notation was Clinical Merciless Transfer of Biological Subject, Case 11E. Her blood turned to ice. Case 11E. Her son. Claire's hands shook as she gathered the papers, her breath sharp and shallow. She marched back into the kitchen, the sound of her steps waking Daniel. He sat up bleary-eyed and then stiffened when he saw the documents clutched in her fists. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice a blade. Daniel rose slowly, words stumbling from his mouth. He tried to explain that it was not what it seemed, that the money was only a promise, that the research facilities had sworn they could provide safety protection answers. They would raise Noah with every resource, shield him from the cruelty of the world. But the words rang hollow. To Claire, they were not promises but betrayals, the language of someone willing to sell their child for the currency of fear. "You tried to sell him." She whispered the words, trembling with fury. $50,000. You wrote his life into a ledger. Daniel reached for her, but she stepped back, her body rigid with rage. "I did it for us," he pleaded. "They were going to come anyway. At least this way we gain something. At least he's safe." "Safe." Her voice cracked. "You think safety is a cage built by men who see him as a specimen? He is not a transaction, Daniel. He is not a case number." Noah stirred in his crib, whimpering at the sharp edges of their voices. Claire turned to soothe him, lifting him into her arms, pressing his warmth against her heart. Her resolve hardened like iron in the heat of fire. "Get out," she said quietly, dangerously calm. Daniel hesitated, torn between argument and surrender. But when he looked into her eyes, he found no opening, no forgiveness. Only the unyielding resolve of a mother who would burn the world before letting it claim her child. He gathered his bag in silence. At the door he paused as if to say something, but the words died before reaching air. He left the door closing behind him with the sound of finality. Claire stood in the quiet aftermath, Noah nestled against her shoulder, his tiny breaths steady. The documents lay scattered on the table, a silent testimony to the truth she had always feared. The danger was not only strangers and institutions. It was also blood. It was also family. She whispered into Noah's hair, the vow sealing itself with each word. "They will not take you, not him, not your father, not anyone." Days later, the fear she had carried found its shape in ink. A letter arrived by certified mail. Its language polished, its cruelty veiled in formality. The Oregon Department of Health and Human Services had filed a petition for custody. A hearing was scheduled. The state would argue that Noah's unique biology warranted research and protection beyond the reach of parental care. Claire read the letter 3 times, the words cutting deeper with each repetition. They would try to take him not through violence or shadows, but through courtrooms, gavels, and the cold machinery of law. Her heart trembled, but her resolve did not. She would fight. She would stand before them all and speak the truth they refused to see. Noah was not a case, not a freak, not a marvel for their laboratories. He was her son, and she would not let him go. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel to follow Noah's journey and many more tales of resilience and love. The courthouse stood at the heart of Portland like a monument carved from stone and certainty. Its columns reached upward with the cold precision of authority, the kind of building that wore its power openly as though daring anyone to question it. For Claire Donovan, walking through its doors felt less like entering a hall of justice and more like stepping into the maw of something vast and indifferent. The morning air had been damp, the kind that clung to clothing and carried the scent of rain-soaked concrete. Claire had dressed Noah carefully in soft cotton, a pale blue sweater tucked over him, his cheeks flushed with the innocence of a child untroubled by the storm swirling around him. She carried him close as if her arms alone could be proof against the machinery waiting within. Patrick Miller walked beside her, silent as always, his presence steady and grounding. Margaret Donovan Daniels' mother stood just behind her, hands clasped tight around a small leather purse, her posture betraying the weight of regret she could no longer conceal. Inside the courtroom buzzed with voices low and sharp, a hive of whispers. Journalists leaned over notebooks, their pens already rehearsing headlines. Camera shutters clicked in the hall before they were banished beyond the oak doors. Lawyers arranged their papers into neat stacks, their faces schooled into expressions of practiced detachment. The state's representatives occupied one side of the aisle, their suits dark, their eyes bright with conviction. Across from them, Claire sat with her attorney, a young woman named Helen Alvarez, whose determination burned hotter than her years would suggest. The petition was read aloud, its language precise, sterile, yet devastating. Noah was described as a minor child of exceptional biological variance whose condition may pose both risks and opportunities for scientific advancement. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into a well. To them, Noah was a phenomenon, a case study, an opportunity wrapped in the skin of a boy. Claire listened with her jaw tight, every syllable pressing against the vow she had made in the cabin's quiet. They spoke of public welfare, of the duty to advance medical understanding, of the balance between individual rights and societal good. They spoke of Noah as though he were already theirs. When her turn came, Claire rose to the stand. The weight of the room pressed down upon her, yet within that pressure she found clarity. She did not carry notes. She did not need them. Her truth lived in her bones. "My son is not a case," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the murmurs. "He is not a medical curiosity, not a marvel to be examined, not an answer to your questions. He is Noah. He drinks warm milk. He smiles when he hears music. He clings to my finger when he falls asleep. Whatever differences exist in him, they do not erase his humanity. They do not erase my right, our right to love him without condition." Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She spoke of the months in the cabin, of the way Noah had laughed at the birds outside the window, of the small rituals that had become the architecture of their days. She described not the science of his existence, but the intimacy of it, the sacred ordinariness that institutions could never replicate. Silence held the courtroom when she finished, a silence that seemed to belong not to the building but to something older, something listening. It was then that Margaret rose from her seat. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her presence commanding in its quiet dignity. She addressed the judge directly, her voice steady. Her words threaded with both shame and resolve. "I was afraid of my grandson," she admitted. "I believed difference was something to fear, to hide, to control. I was wrong. What I see now is not danger, but love. My daughter-in-law's love, unshaken, unyielding, fierce as any force I have known. I will not stand by and watch this child be taken from her arms. Not again. Not in my name." The judge regarded her with an expression unreadable, yet the weight of her words lingered in the air. They were not legal arguments, but they were human ones, and sometimes humanity had the power to reshape law. The state responded with more arguments, more polished phrases, citing precedent and ethical duty. But the words landed thinner now, like paper shields in a storm. The image of Claire holding Noah, the testimony of a grandmother who had once turned away, stood in quiet defiance against their rhetoric. By afternoon, the proceedings drew to a close. The judge's decision would not come until the following day, but the air already carried a shift. Something fragile but undeniable had been planted, a recognition that Noah was not merely theirs to claim. That night, Claire returned to the cabin, the courthouse still echoing in her chest. She sat by the fire, Noah asleep against her shoulder, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Outside, the world remained loud with judgment, with cameras, with voices that demanded ownership. But inside, there was only the warmth of her child and the certainty of love that did not require permission. Whatever tomorrow's ruling would bring, she knew one truth with unshakable clarity: she would fight not because Noah was different, but because he was hers. And that was enough. If you've stayed with Claire's journey this far, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience, healing, and unconditional love. Dawn came softly over Portland, painting the courthouse in pale gold. The air outside was heavy with anticipation, the kind that gathers before verdicts are read and fates are decided. Claire Donovan sat on a wooden bench just beyond the courthouse steps, Noah curled against her chest in quiet sleep. His warmth anchored her against the tremor of uncertainty. Around them, the city was waking, its noise muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When the judge's ruling arrived, it came not in the dramatic tones of cinema, but in the clipped cadence of legal language delivered on paper. Claire's attorney, Helen Alvarez, carried the envelope out to her, the expression on her face measured, careful not to betray too much too soon. Claire's hands shook as she tore the seal. The words blurred at first, her eyes clouded with fear until the meaning broke through. The petition was denied. Noah would remain in her care. No forced custody, no mandated research. The court had found insufficient reason to sever the bond between mother and child. For a long moment, Claire could not breathe. Then the air returned in a rush, and with it came tears she had held back for weeks. Relief did not arrive as joy, but as release, as though a weight that had bent her spine had finally been lifted. She kissed Noah's forehead, pressing her lips against the soft skin that smelled of milk and sleep, and whispered a vow renewed: "You are safe with me." The courthouse crowd thinned. Journalists scribbled headlines that would already be reshaped by tomorrow. Margaret Donovan stood nearby, her navy dress soaked by a light drizzle, her eyes glistening not with triumph, but with humility. Patrick Miller placed a steady hand on Claire's shoulder, offering the kind of strength that required no words. That evening, the cabin in Oregon welcomed them back with the hush of rain against the roof. The fire burned low in the hearth, its glow softening the sharp edges of memory. For the first time in months, Claire allowed herself to breathe without fear that the next knock on the door would strip her life apart. Noah slept deeply in his crib, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt like a hymn. Yet, relief was not the same as an ending. The ruling had quieted the storm, but storms, she knew, always return in other forms. The world had not forgotten Noah. The story had already taken root in the public imagination, threads of rumor woven into folklore speculation humming in corners of the internet. People would always be searching, watching. Claire understood this. She did not dream of erasing the past. Instead, she dreamed of building a future sturdy enough to hold it. Months slipped by, stitched together by the steady rituals of motherhood. Winter loosened its grip, giving way to spring, then summer. Noah grew with astonishing speed, his body lean and strong, his senses sharp in ways that startled her. He learned to crawl with determination, then to walk with a gait that carried both curiosity and confidence. His laughter rang through the cabin, a sound so pure it seemed to cleanse the air itself. The fur that had once marked him had disappeared, leaving behind smooth skin kissed by sunlight. Yet remnants of his difference remained subtle and undeniable. His eyes glowed faintly in dim light, amber flecks catching shadows like embers. His reflexes were quicker than any child's she had known. He could sense shifts in weather before clouds gathered, could still his breath and listen with a concentration that felt almost otherworldly. But to Claire, he was simply Noah, her son, who loved peanut butter sandwiches, who scribbled with crayons until his small hands were stained with color, who giggled at the rhythm of nursery songs. He was not anomaly. He was not legend. He was the center of her world. By autumn, she began to weave their life back into community. A small preschool co-op in a nearby town welcomed Noah without question. The teachers valued patience over perfection, kindness over performance. At first, he stood apart shy and watchful, but within days he was building towers of blocks and chasing butterflies on the playground. Children accepted him as children do with curiosity softened by instinct. To them, he was simply Noah. Claire found herself writing again. Not just translations for clients in distant cities, but stories, fragments of memory pieces of truth reframed as fiction. She wrote about mothers who fought about children who carried both mystery and light about the courage it took to hold on to love when the world demanded surrender. Under a pen name, she sent her words to small magazines. One published her piece, The Boy the World Couldn't Understand. It sparked quiet conversations online, not about monsters, but about compassion, about the resilience of families who refuse to be broken. Life gathered its small joys. On Thanksgiving, Margaret brought a homemade pie, her presence no longer shadowed by shame, but by gratitude. Patrick roasted a turkey, his laughter filling the cabin that had once known only silence. They ate together at the same table that had once been buried beneath legal documents and fear. This time, the table carried warmth, forgiveness, and a quiet recognition of family found again. Yet, shadows never fully vanish. 5 years later, a video surfaced on the internet, a shaky recording of a boy no older than 6 sprinting through the redwoods. His movements were swift, graceful, almost animal. His eyes glowed briefly in the fading light. The clip went viral within hours, igniting speculation, conspiracy theories, whispers of the werewolf child of Oregon. Claire watched the video from her laptop, her face lit by its flickering screen. She recognized the laughter, the way he moved with both innocence and strength. She closed the laptop, gently carried a tray of sandwiches to the back porch, and called into the fading dusk dinner in 10. From the branches of an old oak, Noah waved down at her, grinning before leaping lightly to the ground. He ran toward her with the energy of childhood, barefoot and fearless, his eyes alight with something that would forever set him apart. And yet, when he wrapped his arms around her waist, she knew he was still just a boy who needed his mother's embrace. As she held him close, she realized the world would always create its stories. Some would call him a marvel, others a danger. Still others a mystery meant to be solved. But none of them mattered. To her, Noah was not a headline, not a case study, not a legend. He was her child. And in that truth lay a freedom stronger than any verdict. The years had a way of softening memory, of sanding down the sharp edges of fear, until only their outlines remained. Yet, for Claire Donovan, time was never a gentle eraser. It was a constant reminder that safety was a fragile construction rebuilt every morning and defended every night. Still, she had learned to live within it, to claim joy in the spaces between uncertainty. By the time Noah turned 10, the cabin had transformed. What was once a place of hiding had become a home stitched with laughter and routine. The walls no longer echoed with silence, but with the thrum of lifebooks stacked by the window, watercolor paintings taped crookedly on the fridge, shoes scattered by the door after afternoons of muddy adventures. Patrick Miller had built a small extension in the back, giving Noah his own room painted in shades of sky blue. Margaret had grown older, her hair whiter but her presence steadier. She visited often, carrying stories of the Donovan family that stretched back generations, stories she once would have withheld. Noah thrived, though not always quietly. His abilities, once subtle, grew more difficult to conceal. He could climb trees with the ease of a squirrel run, distances that left other children panting, hear storms before thunderclouds formed. At dusk, his eyes still caught the light in ways that unsettled strangers. Claire taught him caution, the discipline of blending in, of quieting what the world was not yet ready to see. He obeyed, but sometimes with reluctance, as though he already knew that hiding was only a temporary refuge. The world, meanwhile, had not forgotten him. Every few years the whispers resurfaced. A blurred photograph on a message board. A rumor passed through a small town. An anonymous post claiming to have seen the wolf child in the forests of Oregon. Most dismissed it as myth. Others clung to it with the fervor of believers. To Claire, it was a shadow, always just behind them. One autumn evening, long after Margaret had left and Patrick's truck had disappeared down the dirt road, Claire sat on the porch with a mug of tea, watching Noah chase fireflies in the fading light. His movements were fluid, his laughter pure, and for a moment she could almost forget the weight of everything. He darted after one glowing speck, then another, his bare feet silent against the grass. When he stopped, it was not from fatigue, but from awareness. He turned his head toward the tree line, his posture sharpening. Claire's chest tightened. She had seen it before, the stillness, the way he listened to something beyond her hearing. "What is it?" she called, gently. Noah hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing," he answered, though his tone carried a gravity no child should have to bear. He jogged back to her, climbing into her lap with the ease of habit, his small body warm against hers. Claire held him tightly, pressing her lips into his hair, breathing in the familiar scent of leaves and childhood. She knew better than to press. Some truths revealed themselves only when the heart was ready. Years later, when Noah was 16, another video surfaced online. This one, clearer than the last, recorded by hikers in the Cascades. It showed a boy sprinting across a ridge, moving with unnatural speed, leaping over rocks as though gravity were only a suggestion. His eyes, caught by the camera, glowed amber in the fading light. The clip was shared millions of times within days, dissected by skeptics and believers alike. The phrase, "Oregon Wolf Boy," trended, then faded, then returned again in cycles. Claire watched the footage alone in her study, her pen frozen above an unfinished manuscript. Her heart pounded with old fear, but beneath it lived something else, a strange, quiet pride. The world might not understand him. They might twist his image into myth or monster, but she had seen him at the breakfast table, laughing at spilled orange juice. She had seen him kneel in the dirt to rescue an injured bird. She had seen him dream. When Noah returned home that night, his clothes damp from rain, Claire confronted him not with anger, but with steady eyes. "It was you," she said softly. He did not deny it. His shoulders lifted in a quiet shrug. "I don't want to hide forever," he admitted. His voice had deepened with adolescence, carrying both defiance and vulnerability. Claire reached for his hand. "The world isn't ready," she whispered. "Then maybe it never will be," he replied. The conversation ended there, but its weight lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. As the years unfolded, Noah learned to live in the balance, part of the world, part apart from it. He attended school under careful watch, made friends who sensed his difference but never named it, discovered books that expanded his hunger for understanding. Claire guided him with patience, teaching him not just how to survive, but how to remain kind, how to wield strength without cruelty, how to anchor himself in love. And still, the world circled. Journalists occasionally resurfaced the old court case, reprinting grainy photographs of a newborn once called extraordinary. Academics whispered of him in conferences, disguising speculation as theory. Laboratories wrote letters never answered. Through it all, Claire remained steadfast. She carried the memory of the trial, of Margaret's words, of the moment she had stood alone and declared her son more than a specimen. That truth did not change with time. One night, when Noah was 18, they stood together on the porch once more. The stars stretched endless above them, the air sharp with the scent of pine. Noah leaned against the railing, taller now, his frame lean with the strength of youth. "Mom," he said quietly, "why am I different?" Claire had long known the question would come. She had prepared for it, though no answer could ever be complete. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath his skin. "Because the world needs people who are different," she said. "Because sometimes nature creates something new, and because love doesn't require explanations. It only requires choosing." Noah nodded, his gaze lifting to the stars. "Do you think they'll ever accept me?" "Some will," she answered. "Some won't. But acceptance isn't what defines you. You are defined by the way you live, the kindness you give, the strength you choose to use." He turned to her, then his amber eyes catching the starlight, and for a moment she saw not the boy who had terrified doctors or inspired headlines, but the man he was becoming: gentle, resilient, unbroken. In the years to come, the myths would grow. The internet would trade in whisper sightings, blurry photographs. Some would call him miracle. Others would call him monster. But in the small house on the edge of the forest he would remain Noah Donovan, the boy who laughed at bad jokes, who painted the walls with color, who carried both mystery and humanity in equal measure. The world was not yet ready. Perhaps it never would be. But Claire had stopped waiting for permission long ago. As dawn broke once more, light spilling through the trees, she watched her son step into the forest with the fluid grace that had always set him apart. He paused at the edge, glanced back at her, and smiled. And in that smile, Claire saw the truth she had clung to all along. Difference was not a curse. It was a gift. And no matter what stories the world told, love would remain their unshakable answer.